This is Koraidon. It's a legendary Pokemon with a great ability, insane stats, and an awesome signature move. And since becoming tournament legal, it has been overwhelmingly underwhelming. However, after months without a single championship title, Koraidon finally took home its first ever major win at the largest official Pokemon tournament of all time, thanks to one player discovering a totally new way of using it that was able to unlock its full potential. But before we break down why Koraidon couldn't keep up before and what innovation drove it towards greatness, there's something that we have to get out of the way. The player who won the largest tournament of all time and who invented this new way of using Koraidon that allowed it to reach its potential was me. And I feel a little bit weird making this video because in the past when I've made videos that were like similar to this one, I never played any role in the success of the Pokemon that I've been talking about. For example, when Koraidon's counterpart Miraidon first became legal, players straight up just thought that it was awful. But then it won a regional tournament and eventually the World Championships. And I thought the story was interesting, so I made a video on it. But it's not like I played a role in Miraidon's success, nor did I have any input on Zamazenta's journey from useless, forgettable legendary to tournament winning threat. Now, in the end, I obviously have decided to make this video anyway because I think that Koraidon's story is really interesting, but my goal here is really to talk about Koraidon itself rather than to gas myself up for figuring it out. And of course, if you end up liking this video and you want to hear about more other cool stories about underrated Pokemon, make sure you subscribe. You might even hear about the secret third bike that nobody knows about yet. So, what exactly is Koraidon in the first place? Well, the most important thing that you need to know is that Koraidon is a legendary Pokemon, but not just any old regular legendary. Koraidon falls into a classification known as a restricted legendary Pokemon. Restricted legendaries are Pokemon that are normally banned from competitive play, even when other legendary Pokemon are legal, and you're only ever able to use them in certain restricted formats that allow players to use only one or two of them on their teams. This is the full list of restricted Pokemon. And as you can see, there aren't actually that many of them. In past generations, whenever restricted Pokemon were legal, you were allowed to use two of them on your team. However, in Scarlet and Violet's restricted format, players were only allowed to use one, which is a huge shift in what players were used to when it came to using restricted Pokemon. Now, instead of trying to find two restricted Pokemon that happen to work well together, the challenge was instead to find a team of Pokemon that could threaten opposing restricteds, all the while protecting your own. Now, at a glance, Koraidon should have been great in this type of format from the get-go, in large part because of its ability, Orichalcum Pulse. This ability is basically the supercharged version of Groudon's Drought. Groudon is one of the most successful Pokemon of all time, so surely improving upon its incredible ability makes Koraidon immediately overpowered, right? Not only does Orichalcum Pulse set the strong sunlight up, giving you access to one of the strongest field effects in the game, but it also gives Koraidon a separate power boost as long as the strong sunlight is active. Orichalcum Pulse is following a trend of new, super strong abilities that are basically two different abilities mashed into one. In this case, Drought and Photosynthesis. Speaking of, the ability Photosynthesis is exactly the reason why Koraidon should have been so strong in a format with only one restricted Pokemon. Photosynthesis is the signature ability given to all past Paradox Pokemon, and it gives them a stat boost to their highest stat whenever the strong sunlight is active. The past Paradox Pokemon are, on average, significantly stronger than the future ones, and were dominating most of the year without even having access to a way of turning on the strong sunlight. Meaning effectively, these Pokemon were operating without their abilities and they were doing well anyway. Now, paired with a legendary Pokemon that can empower them, you would think that Koraidon Sun teams would be one of the strongest ones out there thanks to the sheer power alone. Except, that isn't what happened. Not at all. Or, well, people did try and pair Koraidon with the various past Paradox Photosynthesis Pokemon, but overall, these teams' performances were just okay. Koraidon would make it to like the semi-finals every now and again, but it wasn't winning. And more often than not, it wasn't really coming all that close. Once people had enough experience with the format and the new Pokemon, the consensus became clear. There were 7 restricted Pokemon that were generally worth using, and Koraidon was exactly the 7th best on that list. Now, this isn't to say that Koraidon was like outright terrible or anything like that. In general, it was being used by between 5 and 10% of the field in most tournaments, and it would occasionally make a deep run within sight of the title. But unlike other restricted Pokemon, it wasn't unusual at all to find 0 Koraidon in the final stages of a tournament, and its inability to convert and overall disappointing finishes meant that it quickly became a Pokemon that many players believed they could just overlook, not preparing against it and not adding counterplay specifically for it when they were team building, because it just wasn't strong enough to warrant that. But why? What was holding Koraidon back? Thanks to its incredible attack and speed stats and its flat-out broken ability, Koraidon should, by all means, be a monster. It's a monster with a fatal flaw: its typing. Fighting and Dragon are both weak to Fairy type attacks, meaning even very weak Fairy type moves threaten to KO Koraidon in one hit. This is a big problem when Pokemon like Fluttermane are so popular, and other restricted Pokemon like Calyrex Shadow and Miraidon very often carry Fairy type coverage moves. Strong Ice and Dragon type attacks also aren't exactly hard to find in the format either, with Pokemon like Calyrex Ice, Chenpao, and Miraidon being capable of knocking out Koraidon in a single hit. Of course, Koraidon does have access to Terastallization, the once per battle mechanic that allows a Pokemon to change its type. And Koraidon has a clear, standout best Terra type too: Fire. This not only turns its Fairy and Ice weaknesses into resistances, but it also gives Koraidon's Fire type moves a power boost that compounds with the boost from Sun and Orichalcum Pulse. Koraidon's best moveset was quickly agreed upon: Protect to stay alive, Flare Blitz for an offensive Fire type move, Flame Charge to pick off weak or low HP Pokemon while also getting a speed boost, and of course, Koraidon's incredible signature Fighting type move, Collision Course, a totally solid, balanced attacker moveset. With Fire serving as both a good defensive and offensive type, Koraidon should have been poised for success. But of course, that didn't happen. The reason why is a bit complicated, but to put it simply, Koraidon just didn't offer enough value compared to the other restricted Pokemon. Every restricted Pokemon seeing success could threaten to take over the game. They did this mostly in 2 ways, with some immediately threatening huge damage from the get-go, while others aim to set up and become stronger over time, sweeping through opposing teams after buying enough time to power up. The one exception to this rule was Zamazenta, who neither focused on taking one-hit knockouts or setting up, but was so incredibly tanky that it was able to sit in the field turn after turn, doing good damage while opponents struggled to remove it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wolf, you told me that Koraidon was so strong. It has so many multipliers, from Sun to its ability to its Terra. Why is it not threatening to take KOs? Well, my friend, there's 2 main reasons for this. First, many of the other restricted Pokemon have a move that hits both of the opponent's Pokemon, and Koraidon just doesn't, so already its damage output is a little bit lower. But secondly, have you heard of the evil and intimidating cat that I hate? Koraidon is a physical attacker, and physical attackers can have their attack stat lowered by any Pokemon with the Intimidate ability, one of the best abilities in all of competitive play. As many of you know, one of the best and most widely used Pokemon in the game is Incineroar, a Pokemon with Intimidate. So even though Koraidon should be doing ridiculous amounts of damage, if it gets intimidated, it loses a huge chunk of its power, preventing it from getting one-hit knockouts. Of course, there is counterplay. The Clear Amulet item prevents your opponents from lowering your Pokemon stats, meaning Koraidon could mostly ignore the cat. And on the one hand, Terra Fire Flare Blitz in the Sun is still very powerful. If it hits a Pokemon that doesn't resist it, it'll pick up a one-hit KO most of the time. But on the other hand, if a Pokemon does resist fire, well, it gets really, really tough. Out of the top 7 restricted Pokemon, one matchup was clearly the worst: Koraidon versus Ice Rider. Wait, Ice Rider is the worst? Surely that's got to be a mistake. Ice Rider is weak to fire type moves. And while yes, that is true in theory, in practice, Ice Rider tended to more accurately be called Terra Fire Rider or Terra Dragon Rider. At the World Championships, Koraidon had a 25% win rate against Ice Rider, worse than any other restricted matchup by a long shot. If Ice Rider terastallized to fire or water or dragon, it could resist Flare Blitz. And to make matters worse, Koraidon is weak to Glacial Lance if it doesn't Terra Fire, and it's weak to high horsepower when it does Terra. Trick Room from Ice Rider also turns Koraidon's high natural speed against it, and that's not even considering any threatening partners. Koraidon needs to commit its Terra to threaten KOs and to stay alive, but it doesn't have that same longevity as many of the other restricted Pokemon, even when it's terrestrialized to fire. And the frailer restricted Pokemon that also have this problem are able to put out quite a bit more damage than Koraidon, leaving it in this sort of awkward middle ground where it's both not quite strong enough, while at the same time it's also not quite tanky enough. So teams built around Koraidon tried to compensate for this by loading up with fast, frail partners that could supplement Koraidon's damage. Pokemon like Chi-Yu and Fluttermane were common. They both take advantage of the sun in different ways and excel at KOing opponents before they can move. Ogerpon Cornerstone became another staple, as a Pokemon that could both deal damage and support its team members with redirection in the form of Follow Me. Its sturdy ability allows it to always survive one attack, meaning that you don't need to worry about training it to survive anything in particular, allowing you to commit all of its stat points to its offense and speed. Lastly, Ditto actually became a common partner thanks to its ability to copy a threatening restricted Pokemon that was setting up and getting out of hand. And this team style did see some success, but in my opinion, it's a really volatile way to play the game. The problem with using such an offensive team is that if you ever wind up on the back foot, it becomes extremely difficult to come back in the game since you just don't have the defenses to switch around. But this was the best way that players figured out how to work around Koraidon's weaknesses. They trained it to be a little bit bulkier, and they tried to play it like both an offensive restricted Pokemon and a bulky restricted one. And while it didn't truly excel in either role, when things went well, it could work. It wasn't bad, it wasn't great, it was just fine. And that's how things stood going into the European International Championships in 2025, the largest official Pokemon tournament ever, when things would finally change for Koraidon. And this is where I come in. Like I said, this video isn't about me, it's about the bike, but I can tell you firsthand just how I reinvented Koraidon. I'll tell the full story in my video about the tournament itself, so for now, let's just talk about Koraidon. I had a team with past Paradox Pokemon that I wanted to power up, so I added Koraidon to get access to the sun. I hopped on the ladder, smacked a Miraidon with my signature move Collision Course, did 60% of their health, and got one shot in return by a critical hit resisted Electro Drift. What? Even without the critical hit, my Collision Course would have done less than their Electro Drift? That really does not feel good. How come Miraidon's signature move gets to be Hydrogen Bomb, but Koraidon's is Coughing Baby? These are their canonical ultimate attacks, so why is one of them so much stronger than the other? This isn't a rhetorical question. Unfortunately for Koraidon, there is an answer, and that answer involves the relationship between these two legendary Pokemon. Koraidon and Miraidon, Scarlet and Violet, the Winged King and the Iron Serpent, the Underdog and the Overdog? Updog? Something like that. These Pokemon both have incredibly powerful abilities, but despite being paired legendaries, they aren't created equal. See, Miraidon's signature ability, Hadron Engine, sets the electric terrain when it hits the field, and also boosts its special attack by 33%. Koraidon's Orichalcum Pulse is functionally identical. It sets the sun and boosts Koraidon's attack by 33%. But there's a key difference between these two abilities, and once again, the problem lies in Koraidon's stupid typing. Miraidon is an electric type Pokemon, and when a Pokemon uses a move that matches one of the types that it has, it gets a massive 50% power boost, referred to as the same type attack bonus, or stab for short. On top of this, Miraidon's electric type moves get boosted by electric terrain, letting it stack crazy multipliers. Now, Koraidon's Sun does boost the power of fire type moves, but you know what Koraidon isn't? A fire type. And even though Collision Course and Electro Drift are similar moves, Miraidon's signature move gets boosted by electric terrain, whereas Collision Course doesn't get boosted by the sun. Koraidon has to terrestrialize to fire to even be on the same playing field as Miraidon, which just isn't fair. If Koraidon's Collision Course got boosted by the sun, it would be fine. But Miraidon gets to use its broken signature move at a power level that Koraidon just can't reach. It kind of makes it feel like Koraidon is only 2/3 of a restricted Pokemon. And when you only get one restricted per team, you really want it to be the best that it can be. But if I was going to make my favorite strategy work, I needed to use Koraidon. No other restricted Pokemon would get the job done. So I kept thinking about it. Surely there has to be a better way of using Koraidon, a way that makes it feel like an actual restricted legendary Pokemon. The consensus on how to use Koraidon thus far has been to lean into its role as a middle ground between offense and defense. But what if there was another way? What if, just like Miraidon, it was possible to turn Koraidon into a one-hit KO machine? Well, if it was going to be possible, the first place to look for an improvement had to be the item. Clear Amulet is a great item at preventing Incineroar from doing what it does best. But if the opponent doesn't have Incineroar, it's basically like you're not even holding an item in the first place. And this got me thinking about Miraidon. See, Koraidon's counterpart didn't become tournament winning material until players gave it the Choice Specs item, an item that boosts its damage by a whopping 50%. Compare this to Koraidon's item choice, which doesn't boost its power level at all. If Miraidon and Koraidon are so similar, wouldn't it make sense that Koraidon needs a power boost too? Is it possible that an offensive, not a defensive item is the key to unlocking Koraidon's potential? Choice Specs boosts special damage, but there is an equivalent on the physical side, the Choice Band. And I wasn't the first player to consider it. Some Koraidon players before me had tried to make Choice Band work. But without even trying it, I knew that it wasn't going to redeem Koraidon. Because here's the thing. Miraidon is strong in part because it can KO nearly every Pokemon in the game, yes. But it's also strong because it's the rare case of a Pokemon being so powerful that a move that you would normally use for utility can also be used for massive damage. In Miraidon's case, that's Volt Switch, a middling power move that does damage and then switches the user out. For most Pokemon, this move would just be used to do a little bit of chip damage, with the switching effect being the main reason to use it. But on Miraidon, it can be used to apply absurd pressure, sometimes picking up KOs in one shot, all the while allowing Miraidon to switch out, resetting the choice specs for the next time it switches in. Now, Koraidon does have a similar move that's called a U-turn, but it wouldn't be nearly as strong as Volt Switch because it's a bug type move, not a fire type move, meaning it isn't boosted by Sun. It also isn't boosted by Stab since Koraidon isn't a bug type. By contrast, Volt Switch gets both Stab and Electric Terrain boosts. So even though these moves have similar effects, they couldn't be further from one another in practice. However, Koraidon does have a Volt Switch equivalent, if not in effect, in spirit. I actually have already mentioned it in this video. Flame Charge. This is a move intended to be quite weak that raises the user's speed after it connects. Given how fast Koraidon is naturally, this might seem like a weak effect. But because of Koraidon's huge base speed, Flame Charge can be used to outspeed opposing Pokemon even when Tailwind is active, or to outspeed opposing Choice Scarf Pokemon, or to be faster than the few Pokemon that naturally outspeed the bike, such as Calyrex Shadow and Regieleki. However, Choice Band Flame Charge is completely counterintuitive, because while Choice Specs resets the move that you're locked into every time you switch out, giving the item great synergy with Volt Switch, Choice Band Flame Charge just leaves Koraidon repeatedly making itself faster without actually being able to use its stronger moves to take advantage of this newfound speed. It's not going to work. But there's another item that could boost Koraidon's damage. The Life Orb. This provides a 30% power increase to all moves, but causes the holder to lose 10% of their health whenever they land an attack. The recoil can stack up pretty quickly, but on the other hand, the power increase is no joke. Could this be the secret to unlocking Koraidon's potential? I give Koraidon the orb to ponder, hop on the ladder, collision course in Miraidon, and do about 90% before dying to critical hit Electro Drift once again. So close, and yet so far. If I could just pick up the one-hit KO on a Pokemon as bulky as Miraidon, I feel like it could completely change how Koraidon feels to use. But I'm still falling short, and it just seems impossible to get there. I'm using the strongest item that I can afford, and Koraidon doesn't have a better move than Collision Course. Wait, it doesn't have a better move? That's true. I mean, Collision Course is an incredible move, and that's the reason why no other Koraidon ever drop it. It's just too good. But I only need a little bit more power, and while Collision Course might be Koraidon's best fighting type attack, it actually isn't the strongest option, because Koraidon also gets the move Close Combat, which has a slightly higher 120 base power, but lowers both of the user's defenses whenever it connects. It's never been considered before because for only 20 more base power, you're making it way harder for Koraidon to, you know, survive. But remember, past Koraidon players have been trying to play Koraidon as a somewhat bulky attacker. And given that I'm already using the Life Orb, I'm comfortable using Koraidon as a self-destructing delete button. Yes, normally close combat would just be worse than collision course, but when combined with the Life Orb, this worse move finally unlocks Koraidon's full potential. Now, instead of being a Pokemon stuck between bulk and offense, it completely sacrifices its staying power in favor of becoming a Pokemon with damage output that actually looks like a legendary. With Life Orb Close Combat, Koraidon can not only one-hit KO Miraidon, but also many other common Pokemon such as Urshifu and Ogerpon. But wait, what about Incineroar? The attack drop from Intimidate is more than the power boost you get from Life Orb. Isn't that a problem? Well, yeah, maybe in a vacuum it would be, but a new moveset wasn't the only innovation needed to get Koraidon online. In addition to reinventing the Pokemon itself, I also introduced new partners to the mix. Partners with an incredible matchup against the cat. With a different supporting cast, my opponent was welcome to bring Incineroar to the matchup to lower Koraidon's attack stat, but in doing so, they'd be playing with a Pokemon that did not match up well against the Pokemon that I was bringing. Now remember, on previous Koraidon teams, the teammates selected were offensive Pokemon intended to supplement Koraidon's lacking damage output. But that's not exactly needed when Koraidon can just KO everything on its own. So I chose new partner Pokemon that excelled at defense, not offense. Specifically, Incineroar and Amoonguss, replacing the more offensive Pokemon Chi-Yu and Ogerpon Rock on traditional Koraidon teams. Amoonguss could put my opponents to sleep, preventing them from attacking, buying room for Koraidon to take KOs without fear of getting knocked out afterwards. And Incineroar could not only slow opposing Pokemon down with Intimidate and Fake Out, but it could also take advantage of the sun offensively to power up its Flare Blitz, giving it shocking offensive pressure for a Pokemon known for its defense. Fluttermane stuck around, though with a different set than the Koraidon teams that came before. Prior to my team, most Koraidon teams used Booster Energy Fluttermane, an item that activates photosynthesis outside of the strong sunlight. This allowed Fluttermane to be led alongside Chi-Yu without needing Koraidon to already have been sent out in order to get the speed advantage. However, because of my team had such a solid defensive backbone, I was confident that I could get Sun Up if I needed to, thanks to Incineroar and Amoonguss allowing me to reposition without fear. So I selected the Focus Sash for Fluttermane, an item that allows it to always take one attack, which then let it work both as a supporter for Koraidon, using the move Icy Wind to slow down foes and open them up for a Koraidon attack, and as a late game cleanup Pokemon after Koraidon had torn through most of my opponent's health. The last two Pokemon I added were a 2-Pokemon Perish Trap duo in Gothitelle and Screamtail. These two Pokemon allowed me to fully sidestep the Ice Rider matchup, as Perish Song could remove the horse, clearing the path for Koraidon. Gothitelle was also useful against Kyogre and Terrapagos teams that tended to rely pretty heavily on a cycling cast of partners to keep their restricted safe, preventing them from executing their game plan by locking them in with the Shadow Tag ability. These 6 Pokemon combined to create a situation that every team builder dreams of, a team with almost exclusively good matchups across the board. And this was only possible because, as I mentioned earlier, players weren't worrying about their Koraidon matchup, believing that they didn't need to pay attention to it as it wasn't a very popular choice, and also nobody thought that it was all that strong. With Koraidon flying under the radar as a whole, opponents had not only not thought about what to do versus a strong team that used one, they often didn't even have the tools on their team to handle it in the first place. Which is why, at the largest official live Pokemon tournament ever, my team was able to tear through the competition. Along the way, I beat the #1 ranked player in the world, the reigning world champion using his world championship team, and countless other strong trainers. And the most remarkable thing about it was, I did it all while getting unlucky in the matchups that I drew. I did not play against a single Zamazenta or Kyogre team, 2 of my best matchups in the tournament. Out of 16 rounds, I only played against 2 Terrapagos, which is one of the most one-sided matchups that I have ever had, and the matchup that I was hoping to see the most. Instead, I played more Shadow Rider than any other restricted, which was arguably my worst matchup out of the top 7 restricteds, though I was still able to beat all but one of them. In the end, although I certainly played well, it was the team that gave me an edge into a vast majority of the field, and it was all thanks to a Pokemon just written off as okay. At the time that I'm recording this, I haven't had a chance to see where Koraidon goes from here, whether my team is a flash in the pan or whether it completely redefines the Pokemon. I can tell you what I expect though. My prediction is that Koraidon will finally enter the metagame as a force to be reckoned with. I think people will experiment with different partner Pokemon, maybe dropping the Perish Trap mode, but ultimately keeping most of the core the same. And I think that Koraidon will see far more success than it had previously. Koraidon, to me, is a story about how sometimes first impressions can be deceiving, and about how sometimes the most obvious way to use a Pokemon isn't always the best one. Pokemon is a really cool and nuanced game, and I can't help but wonder how many other Pokemon are out there waiting for somebody to realize their full potential. Now, I actually alluded to this earlier in the video, but Miraidon actually followed a somewhat similar, though a little bit less exaggerated arc as well, where at first, players thought Miraidon was like really bad, and then it won the first tournament that it was legal for. I think it's an interesting story. I made a video on it. If you like this video, you should check out that one as well.